My name is Amanda Jones. I am 31 years old, and last Christmas my entire childhood flipped in one quiet minute at my mother's dining table. For most of my life, I was the background noise in my own family. The daughter who set the plates washed, the pans kept her grades high, and learned to smile without taking up space. My mother, Linda Jones, is 58. My father, Robert Jones, is 62. They built their world around my brother, Ethan Jones, 35, and they trained me to orbit. Christmas night looked warm from the outside. The house smelled like turkey and cinnamon, the lights blinked in the window, and the table was full. The seating was the same old map of importance. Ethan at the best end, my mother close to him, my father beside her, me at the side chair near the kitchen doorway, the seat you can leave from without anyone noticing. I had booked a small hotel near the airport so I could have a door that was mine, but I still walked into that dining room with my body remembering every time I was told to be grateful. Be quiet, be easy, because Ethan needed more. Dinner started the way it always did, with attention flowing toward Ethan as naturally as gravity. My mother passed him the potatoes first. My father poured him the good wine. They asked about his latest plan, and Ethan launched into a speech about a new online sports gear store, how he just needed a little capital to get it off the ground. My mother nodded like he was already a success story. She said she was so proud. I ate quietly, cutting turkey into neat squares, listening to them talk over me like I was furniture. When my mother finally remembered I existed, she asked if I was still doing my little office job. She did not ask where I lived now. She did not ask what I was building. She asked if I was managing to pay my bills the way you talk to a teenager, babysitting for gas money. Ethan smirked and said, "Come on, Mom, you know Amanda is fine. She has her little project." Then he looked straight at me and asked if I was still wasting my time on that worthless thing I call a career. Worthless. The word hit the table like a fork dropped onto a plate. My mother did not correct him. My father did not look up. The room waited to see if I would shrink the way I always used to. I felt the old pressure in my chest, that urge to explain myself to earn space to make them see me. Then I felt something colder and steadier, like a hand on my shoulder, reminding me I was not that kid anymore. I took one slow sip of water and set the glass down carefully so it did not clink. I looked at Ethan and said calmly that before anyone asked me for money, we needed to talk about something real. My mother blinked. Ethan laughed because laughter is his shield. My father frowned and asked what I meant. My mother leaned forward with that sweet voice she uses right before she makes a demand. She said Ethan had hit a rough patch, and as a family, we needed to be supportive. My father added that Ethan was their son, that sometimes men need time to find their footing, and he said it like a fact of nature. In that moment, it clicked with brutal clarity. I was not invited because they missed me. I was invited because they were cornered. They had bet on the golden child for decades, and the bet was coming due. They had poured money, attention, excuses, and forgiveness into Ethan until it became a bottomless well, and now the well was asking for one more bucket. They looked at me like I was the extra bucket they could reach for, because that had always been my role, the spare, the backup plan, the daughter trained to carry what the son dropped. I pushed my chair back a few inches and reached down for my bag. I pulled out a plain folder thick enough to be heavy, the kind you see in a courthouse or a bank. My mother stiffened the moment she saw it, like her body recognized authority even when her mind did not. My father said sharply, "What is that?" Ethan rolled his eyes and muttered that I brought paperwork to Christmas because of course I did. I placed the folder on the table and opened it with slow care. The top page was a county record printout, clean black type, dates, signatures, and a legal description that did not care about feelings. I watched my mother's eyes move down the page, then stop hard. I watched the color drain from her face so fast it looked like someone pulled a plug. My father leaned in, jaw tight, reading in silence. Ethan reached for the paper, still smiling, still sure it was a stunt. I kept my palm flat on the page, not grabbing, not fighting, just final. Then the silence landed heavy and loud. The humming refrigerator suddenly sounded like a warning. My mother's fingers loosened around her fork and it slipped, tapping the plate once, a small, sharp sound that felt like a crack in glass. Ethan finally stopped smirking. His eyes flicked to my face like he was searching for the joke. My father swallowed and his voice came out rough as he demanded where I got that. I leaned forward and said clear and steady that before we talked about loans and family loyalty, we needed to talk about ownership because the county records on that table said one thing in plain ink, and it changed everything about this house, this dinner, and the way they had treated me my entire life. The word ownership hung in the air like smoke after a small explosion, and for a few seconds no one moved. I could hear my own breathing slow and deliberate, the way my therapist taught me to breathe when my body expects danger. My mother, Linda Jones, 58, was the first to recover. She reached for the page as if proximity alone could rewrite it. Her lips moved silently while she read, then she laughed once short and sharp and said there must be some mistake because this house had always been theirs. My father, Robert Jones, 62, leaned closer, squinting at the lines, his jaw set, in the way it always was right before he decided someone needed to be put back in their place. Ethan Jones, 35. My brother snorted and said it was obviously fake, that anyone could print something off the internet, that I had always been dramatic. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I slid the second page forward, then the third, each one heavier than the last, each one bearing stamp dates and a recording number from the county clerk. I said quietly that these were certified copies recorded 8 months ago, notarized and legally binding. My mother shook her head and said this was cruel, that Christmas was not the time for tricks, that families do not ambush each other with paperwork. My father demanded to know who put me up to it because in his world I never acted alone. I was always influenced, guided, controlled. Ethan laughed again louder this time and said there was no way Grandma Eleanor would do something like this. Not without telling them, not without telling him. Hearing her name tightened something in my chest, but it also steadied me. Eleanor Jones, 87, when she passed, had always spoken softly, but she had not been weak. She had watched. She had taken notes. I told them that Grandma Eleanor had executed a living deed transferring ownership while she was alive, and that she had done it with a lawyer present because she wanted it done cleanly. My mother stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. She said I was lying, that Eleanor was confused at the end, that I had manipulated an old woman who did not know what she was signing. That accusation cut deep because it was exactly the story they told themselves to excuse everything else. I met my mother's eyes and said that Eleanor had been sharp, that she had known exactly what she was doing, and that she had asked me to promise one thing, that I would not explain her reasons for her. My father slammed his palm on the table and told me to stop playing games. He said that even if the papers were real, this house was family property built with family money, and that I had no right to come in and claim it like a stranger. Ethan leaned back in his chair and smirked again, confidence seeping back in. He said fine, even if it was in my name, we could fix it, because paperwork can be changed, because families figure things out, because I would not really do this to them. That was the moment I understood how deep the entitlement ran. They were not shocked by the idea that I owned the house. They were shocked that I might say no. I reached back into my bag and pulled out another envelope, thinner, cream-colored with a law firm letterhead. My mother froze when she saw it. My father went still. Ethan frowned. I said this was a cease and desist letter drafted by Margaret Hill, 60 years old, the attorney who handled Eleanor's affairs for over a decade. I said it instructed them to stop any attempt to sell refinance or encumber the property effective immediately, and that any violation would be pursued in civil court. My mother's face crumpled not with remorse, but with calculation. She asked what Ethan was supposed to do, now her voice rising like the problem was logistics, not years of neglect. My father said this was ungrateful, that after everything they had done for me, I was turning my back on my own blood. Ethan stood up and leaned over the table, his face flushed, and said I had stolen his future, that this was supposed to be his inheritance, that everyone knew it. I felt the old fear spark the instinct to appease, but it burned out just as fast. I told him calmly that inheritances are not assigned by volume or expectation. They are decided by the owner, and Grandma Eleanor had decided. The room erupted, then voices overlapping, accusations flying. My mother cried that I was tearing the family apart. My father said I was selfish and vindictive. Ethan cursed and kicked his chair back. Through it all, I stayed seated, hands flat on the table, my voice steady when I spoke. I said that I had not come to fight, that I had come because they had asked me for help, and the only help I was offering was the truth. The truth was that the house was mine, legally and completely. The truth was that their plan to sell it to cover Ethan's debts would not happen. And the truth was that this conversation was long overdue. When the noise finally died down, the silence felt different than before. It was not confusion anymore. It was fear. The fear in the room pushed me backward in time the way it always did, dragging me to the place where it began long before property records and lawyers and cease and desist letters back when I was a child, learning the rules of our house without anyone ever stating them out loud. I was 6 years old the first time I understood that being quiet was safer than being seen. We lived in the same house than the one my parents now called family property, the one my brother always referred to as his future. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway on a Saturday morning, my feet cold on the tile, watching my mother lace Ethan's cleats while my father checked his watch. Ethan was 10, already tall for his age, already confident, bouncing on his heels, as if the world had been built to absorb his energy. They were late for his baseball game, the kind with folding chairs and loud parents and trophies handed out just for showing up. My mother told me to stay inside and keep an eye on the oven. She said she trusted me because I was mature for my age. That was the first compliment that doubled as a responsibility. While they cheered from the bleachers, I pulled cookies out of the oven by myself, burning my fingers and crying quietly so I would not be accused of being dramatic. When they came home hours later, sunburned and smiling, they did not ask what I had done all day. They asked how Ethan played. That pattern repeated itself in 1,000 small ways. When Ethan needed something, it appeared. When I needed something, it became a discussion about budgets and timing and whether it was really necessary. By the time I was 8, I knew not to interrupt conversations about my brother's future. I knew to wait until my mother was finished talking on the phone to one of his coaches before asking for help with homework. I learned to read the room the way other kids learned to read books. At 9, I started setting the table without being asked. At 10, I learned how to cook simple meals because my mother said it helped her when she was tired from worrying about Ethan. At 11, I stopped telling them when I got good grades because every time I tried, my father would nod distractedly and say that school always came easy to girls, that real pressure was on boys. Those words settled into me like sediment, layer after layer, shaping how I saw myself. The house itself seemed to agree with them. Ethan's room was bigger, brighter, filled with new posters and equipment and the hum of electronics. Mine was smaller, tucked away, painted once, and never updated as if it was temporary as if I was. When relatives visited for holidays, they brought Ethan gifts that took up space. Sports gear, gadgets, games. For me, there were sweaters, books, things you could fold and stack away. I was praised for being low maintenance, for not asking for much, for being easy. No one ever asked why I had learned to be that way. My father, Robert, 62 now, but larger than life, then ruled the house with his voice. He did not need to hit me to make his point. A look was enough, a slammed door, a comment about how I was lucky to have a roof over my head. My mother, Linda, 58, now smoothed over his moods by directing my attention elsewhere by telling me that my job was to keep the peace. Ethan could shout, break things, sulk for days. Boys were like that, she said. They needed room. I needed to be understanding. By 12, I understood perfectly. I understood that love in our house flowed downhill toward Ethan, and that if I wanted any of it, I would have to stand in the runoff and pretend it was enough. I also understood something else, something quieter and more dangerous. I understood that no one was coming to rescue me, and that if I wanted a different life, I would have to build it myself piece by piece, without applause. Sitting at the Christmas table decades later, listening to my parents argue about a house they assumed would always belong to them and to Ethan by extension, I could see those early lessons clearly for the first time. The property records on the table were not just about land and walls and money. They were about a lifetime of being trained to disappear and the moment I finally decided to stop. Those early lessons hardened during the years when my body grew faster than my voice, when I was old enough to understand danger, but still young enough to be trapped inside it. Between the ages of 10 and 14, our house did not need bruises to be violent. It ran on intimidation control and the constant reminder that comfort was conditional. My father, Robert Jones, ruled through volume and silence in equal measure. When he was pleased, the house breathed. When he was not, every room shrank. He never had to raise a hand to make me flinch. He only had to stand too close, lower his voice, and ask me what I thought I was doing. My mother learned to read his moods before the rest of us and adjusted accordingly. She would send me to my room when his jaw tightened, tell me to be helpful when his patience wore thin, tell me not to provoke him by asking questions at the wrong time. Ethan learned a different lesson. When he slammed doors or shouted back, my mother called it passion. When he broke things, my father said boys needed an outlet. When I spilled a glass of milk, my father asked if I had rocks in my head. When I forgot to take out the trash, he lectured me about respect and responsibility until my ears rang. I became skilled at disappearing in plain sight. I walked quietly. I kept my eyes down. I learned to apologize before anyone accused me of anything because apologies were currency and I needed them to survive. The worst moments were not the shouting. They were the waiting, the long dinners where no one spoke and every scrape of a fork felt like a test. The car rides where the radio stayed off and my father's silence pressed against the windows. My mother would glance at me in the rearview mirror, her eyes warning me not to speak, not to make it worse. She framed it as protection, but it trained me to accept fear as normal. Ethan, meanwhile, grew louder and more certain. At 12, he punched a hole in the drywall after losing a video game. My father laughed and said it was a cheap fix. I watched my mother patch the wall the next day, smoothing it over like she smoothed everything else. At 13, Ethan shoved me during an argument and told me to stay out of his way. When I told my mother, she sighed and said siblings fight, that I should not escalate things, that Ethan was under pressure. I learned then that my safety ranked below his comfort. School became my refuge not because it was easy, but because it was predictable. Rules were written down. Consequences made sense. When I did well, the results showed up in ink, not mood. Still, even my achievements were framed as convenience. My mother said it was good that I did not need much supervision. My father said girls matured faster, that it was expected. No one celebrated. No one asked how I managed the knots in my stomach or the way my hands shook when my father raised his voice. By 14, I was doing my own laundry, packing my own lunches, and managing my own schedule, not because it was empowering, but because it kept me out of the line of fire. I watched my mother spend hours researching opportunities for Ethan tutors camps, programs that promised to unlock his potential. When I asked about an art class I wanted to take, my father scoffed and said hobbies were for people with time and money to waste. My mother suggested I focus on practical things, that it was important for girls to be useful. That word followed me everywhere. Useful. It meant compliant. It meant invisible. It meant absorbing damage without complaint. There were nights when I lay awake listening to my parents argue behind their closed door, my mother's voice tight and pleading, my father's sharp and final. In the morning, everything would reset. My mother would smile and act as if nothing had happened. Ethan would complain about breakfast. I would get ready for school in silence. That cycle taught me something vital. Violence did not always leave marks, but it always left patterns. It taught me that power was rarely loud in public and often ruthless in private. Sitting at the Christmas table years later, watching my father glare at me as if I had broken an unspoken rule, by bringing proof into the light, I recognized the same mechanism at work. They were not angry because I was wrong. They were angry because I was no longer afraid. The property records threatened more than their finances. They threatened the system that had kept me small, the system that depended on my silence to function. And for the first time, I understood that the fear in the room did not belong to me anymore. By the time I was 14, the hierarchy in our house was no longer subtle, it was operational, and every decision my parents made was filtered through one question they never asked out loud. How does this help Ethan? Ethan Jones, 35 now, was treated like an investment portfolio that could not fail no matter how many warning signs appeared. When he reached high school, my parents toured private academies like they were shopping for a future that belonged to all of us, but only in theory. They debated tuition at the dinner table, not whether they could afford it, but which school would give him the best edge. My father talked about connections. My mother talked about opportunity. When the acceptance letter came, they celebrated like it was a championship win. I stood in the doorway holding a stack of mail that included my own school paperwork, and no one noticed. Ethan got new uniforms. new shoes, a laptop that hummed softly at night through his bedroom wall. He had tutors twice a week and summer programs that cost more than my entire year of necessities. When he complained about the workload, my mother sympathized and made his favorite meals. When I asked if I could get a used drawing tablet for a class I wanted to take, my father asked what possible return there was on something like that. He said boys needed tools, girls needed sense. The message was consistent. Ethan was potential. I was maintenance. At 16, Ethan got his first car, a used sedan my parents framed as a practical choice. It still felt like freedom. I watched him drive off while my mother waved from the porch. When I asked about learning to drive, my father said it was not urgent, that I could take the bus, that he did not have time to teach me. My mother suggested I wait until college. College itself was another study in contrast. My parents talked openly about paying for Ethan's tuition, about loans they would take if needed, about sacrifices they were willing to make. When I brought home brochures from a state school I could afford with scholarships and part-time work, my mother smiled with relief and said it was good I was so independent. She said it like praise, but it landed like dismissal. I learned to translate their language. Independent meant unsupported. Strong meant neglected. Easy meant unseen. The older Ethan got, the more room he took up. When he failed a class, my parents blamed the teacher. When he lost interest in a program, they blamed the school. When he partied too hard, they blamed stress. Every failure became evidence that he needed more help. Every success, even small ones, became proof that the investment was paying off. Meanwhile, my successes were treated as confirmation that I did not require resources. When I worked evenings and weekends to save money, my mother told relatives how proud she was that I did not burden them. When I brought home awards, my father nodded and said that was nice, then asked if Ethan needed a ride to practice. I started putting my paychecks into a separate account they did not know about, not out of rebellion, but out of instinct. Something in me understood that security would never come from them. At 18, when Ethan graduated with fanfare and a trip planned as a reward, my parents threw a party that filled the backyard with people. There were speeches and photos and tears. When I graduated 2 years later, my mother bought a cake from the grocery store and apologized that she was tired. She said we would do something special later. Later never came. These moments stacked quietly, forming a ledger in my mind. Not a list of grievances to throw back at them, but a record of reality, a way to remember what was true when they tried to rewrite it. Watching my parents now, decades later, argue over a house they had assumed would be the final payoff for their unwavering bet on Ethan, I could see the pattern in full. They had not just favored him. They had structured their entire financial and emotional lives around the belief that he was the only one worth backing. The property records on the table did not just threaten their plans. They exposed the cost of a system that demanded endless sacrifice from one child to subsidize the illusions built around another. The sacrifices that were framed as character building hardened into expectations as I crossed into adulthood, and by the time I understood I was allowed to want things for myself, I had already been trained not to ask. At 19, while Ethan was experimenting with majors and drifting through semesters funded by my parents' patience and money, I took a job after classes at a local cafe and another on weekends cleaning offices. I told myself it was temporary, that it would help with books and rent, but the truth was simpler. I did not believe help was coming. Every dollar I earned felt like a small shield I could raise between myself and the chaos of our house. My mother praised my work ethic to her friends, telling them how proud she was that I never needed anything. My father liked to joke that I was the practical one, the one who would be fine no matter what. Those words followed me like a sentence. When Ethan dropped out of a program he lost interest in, my parents called a family meeting. They sat at the kitchen table and talked about how hard the world was on young men, how unfair expectations could crush confidence. They talked about taking out a loan to give him time to reset. I listened quiet until my mother turned to me and asked if I could move back home for a while to help with expenses. She said it was just until things stabilized that families pull together. I agreed because saying no felt dangerous, because I had been taught that refusal was betrayal. Moving back meant sleeping in my old room, the one that still felt temporary, and handing over a portion of my paycheck every month without questions. It meant cooking dinners so my mother could focus on Ethan running errands, smoothing over arguments, absorbing tension. When my father snapped, I apologized. When Ethan complained, I adjusted. When my mother cried about how worried she was, I listened. My own life shrank to the edges. I postponed plans, turned down opportunities, told myself I was being responsible. The violence in those years was not loud. It was the erosion of choice. It was the way my father would stand in doorways, arms crossed, asking why I was home late, asking who I thought I was asking if I wanted to make things harder for everyone. It was the way my mother would remind me how much Ethan needed us, how fragile he was, how grateful I should be that I could help. It was the way Ethan treated my time and money as a given borrowing without promising to pay me back when his next idea took off. He never did. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself family meant endurance. But endurance without consent is just another word for control. The turning point did not come as a dramatic blow. It came quietly, the way truth often does. One night, after a particularly long shift, I came home to find my father and Ethan arguing in the living room. Voices raised anger sharp. My mother was crying in the kitchen. When I tried to slip past my father, turned on me and demanded to know why dinner was not ready. The unfairness of it hit me all at once, the years of labor and silence and sacrifice crashing together. I said I was tired. I said I needed rest. My father stepped closer and told me not to get smart. My mother begged me to keep the peace. Ethan rolled his eyes and said I was always making things about me. Something inside me went still. I realized that no amount of giving would ever be enough because the system required me to be empty to function. That night, I opened a new bank account and rerouted my paychecks. I began planning an exit the way people plan escapes quietly, carefully, without announcing it to anyone who might stop me. I started gathering documents, birth certificates, records, anything that proved who I was independent of them. When I told my mother months later that I was moving out for good, she accused me of abandoning the family. My father said I was ungrateful. Ethan asked who would help him now. I left anyway, carrying everything I owned in 2 suitcases, my hands shaking not from fear, but from the effort of doing something I had never been allowed to do before. Watching them now, years later, react to the property records with outrage and disbelief, I could see how deeply they had relied on my compliance. They had mistaken my endurance for consent, my silence for agreement. The house on that table was not just a building. It was the symbol of every sacrifice they assumed I would continue to make. And this time, I was done. My escape from that house did not mean I escaped its gravity, not immediately, and the only person who seemed to understand that was my grandmother, Eleanor Jones. She was 87 when she died, but long before that she had been the quiet witness to everything my parents preferred not to see. Eleanor lived alone in a small bungalow across town, a place that smelled like lavender and old paper, where time moved slower and conversations did not feel like negotiations. While my parents treated her as an obligation to be managed, and Ethan treated her as a potential inheritance to be courted, I showed up because she asked me to, because she needed groceries, carried in light bulbs, changed paperwork, read aloud. I never thought of it as devotion. It was simply the first relationship in my life where care flowed both ways. Eleanor noticed things. She noticed how I flinched when voices rose. She noticed how I apologized before making requests. She noticed how I always arrived early and left late as if I needed to earn my place. One afternoon, while we sat at her small kitchen table sorting mail, she asked me why I never talked about my own plans. I laughed it off the way I always did, but she did not let it go. She said families have a way of shrinking the people they rely on most, and that shrinking looks like kindness until you stand back and see the pattern. She told me she had watched my parents pour their hopes into Ethan, like water into cracked ground, and she told me she had watched me become the one who filled the gaps without being thanked. When Ethan visited Eleanor, which happened only when he needed something, he made big promises. He talked about businesses and returns and how he would take care of her someday. Eleanor listened politely, then asked him practical questions he never answered. After he left, she would sigh and say that charm is not the same thing as character. Over time, Eleanor began to keep records. Not in a dramatic way, but in the methodical way of a woman who had lived long enough to know that memory is easily dismissed. She kept notes about conversations, dates of visits who showed up and who did not. She kept copies of bank statements and property documents. She asked me to help her organize them, and in doing so, she taught me how to read the language of authority, the kind printed in small font that carries real weight. One evening, after my father had snapped at me during a family dinner and my mother had pretended not to notice, Eleanor pulled me aside. She told me she had seen that look on my father's face before, the look of a man who believes he is owed obedience. She told me she would not leave me unprotected. I did not know what she meant then, and I did not ask. I had learned that questions could be dangerous. Months later, Eleanor asked me to drive her to an appointment with her attorney, Margaret Hill, 60 years old. A woman with calm eyes and a firm handshake. I sat in the waiting room flipping through a magazine while they met behind a closed door. When Eleanor came out, she squeezed my hand and told me she loved me. She did not explain. She did not need to. The shift came slowly after that. Eleanor insisted that I be present for certain conversations, that I help review documents, that I understand how things worked. She told me that women who rely on goodwill end up paying for it, and that women who rely on the law at least know where they stand. When Eleanor's health declined, I was the one who managed appointments and medications. Ethan visited once and complained about the drive. My parents sent flowers and excuses. Eleanor watched it all with clear eyes. On her last good day sitting in the sunlit living room, she told me that love without accountability rots families from the inside. She told me that if anyone tried to make me feel guilty for standing on solid ground, it was because they had built their lives on mine without permission. Sitting at the Christmas table now with her paperwork spread between plates and glasses, I could feel Eleanor's presence like a steady hand at my back. The property records were not an act of revenge. They were an act of protection planned by the only person in my family who had ever seen me clearly and decided I was worth defending. The moment Eleanor decided to act did not arrive with a dramatic announcement or a confrontation, because she understood my family too well to believe they would respond to anything but finality. Instead, it came in fragments, in the way she asked sharper questions and waited longer for answers, in the way she watched my father's temper and my mother's excuses collide. One afternoon, while I was helping her sort through old photographs, my father arrived unannounced. He walked through her door as if it were his, commenting on the dust, the clutter, the way she should really consider downsizing. Eleanor listened, her expression mild, while he lectured her about family and responsibility. When he turned to me and asked why I looked tired, the old reflex kicked in, the instinct to minimize, to deflect. Before I could answer, Eleanor spoke. She asked my father why he thought it was acceptable to speak to me the way he did. The room went quiet. My father laughed it off, said he was just being honest, that he was trying to toughen me up. Eleanor did not smile. She said honesty without care is cruelty, and that she had watched him practice it for years. My mother arrived later, flustered and apologetic, smoothing the air, insisting we were all just stressed. Ethan did not come at all. That absence mattered more than any argument. After they left, Eleanor closed the door and leaned against it, her shoulders heavy. She told me that men like my father rely on the silence of others to feel powerful, and that families often protect abusers by calling endurance love. She said she had stayed quiet too long, thinking time would soften things. It had not. A week later, Eleanor asked me to sit with her while she made a list. Not a will, she said, not yet, but an accounting. She wrote down dates when my parents asked for money, times Ethan borrowed without returning, instances when she had offered help and been brushed aside. She included moments when she had witnessed my father's temper turn the room cold. She said this was not to punish anyone, but to remember accurately, because accuracy is the first casualty of family mythology. As her health declined, the control in my parents' voices sharpened. My mother began calling more often, pressing Eleanor to move closer to let them handle things. My father talked about selling the house someday, about how it would help Ethan get back on his feet. Eleanor listened and asked questions. Who would manage the sale? Where would she live? What guarantees would be in place? They waved her concerns away. They always had. That dismissal was the final confirmation she needed. Eleanor scheduled another appointment with Margaret Hill and asked me to come this time. In the office, Eleanor spoke plainly. She said she wanted to transfer ownership of the house to me while she was alive through a living deed, so there would be no confusion, no delays, no opportunities for pressure. She said she trusted me to make fair decisions, not generous ones born of guilt. Margaret explained the process in careful terms, the recording, the notarization, the permanence. I sat there, stunned, my hands folded in my lap, afraid to speak. Eleanor reached across the desk and told me that protection is not favoritism, it is correction. She said she was not choosing me over Ethan. She was choosing accountability over chaos. When the papers were signed, Eleanor insisted on copies being stored in multiple places. She taught me how to check the county records myself, how to verify what was filed, how to understand the language that could not be argued away by shouting. She told me not to tell my parents yet, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted the truth to exist independently of their reaction. Months later, when her health took a sharp turn, my parents swooped in with urgency that felt performative. They talked about hospice and decisions and being there, but when it came time to sit through long nights or handle the unglamorous details, they deferred to me. Ethan visited once uncomfortable and impatient, asking about the house as if it were already his. Eleanor heard him from the bedroom and asked me to tell him to leave. She did not want her last days filled with entitlement. When she died, my parents grieved loudly. There were speeches about family and sacrifice. There were hugs for Ethan and nods for me. They spoke about Eleanor's home as if it were already folded into their future plans. I did not correct them then. I was still learning that timing is part of justice. Now, sitting at the Christmas table with those same assumptions cracking under the weight of recorded truth, I understood what Eleanor had been protecting me from. She knew that when violence is normalized, fairness feels like betrayal. She knew that my family would only respect boundaries they could not cross. And she knew that one day I would need something stronger than memory to stand my ground. The transfer itself happened without ceremony, the way Eleanor preferred things to happen quietly and correctly, with no room for misinterpretation later. In the weeks after that second meeting with Margaret Hill, Eleanor insisted on reviewing every detail again, not because she doubted the decision, but because she wanted me to understand the mechanics of it. She sat at her kitchen table with a magnifying glass and a legal pad, reading each clause out loud, pausing to explain why certain language mattered and other language did not. She told me that families like ours survive on ambiguity, that they thrive in the gray areas where assumptions can be stretched and guilt can be applied. The deed she signed was not ambiguous. It named me Amanda Jones as the sole owner of the property effective immediately. It specified that the transfer was a gift made freely and knowingly. It carried her signature, the notary stamp, and the recording instructions that would place it permanently in the county system. Eleanor asked me to drive her to the clerk's office myself. She said it was important that I see where truth lives when people try to argue with it. We waited in a small room with hard chairs and faded posters about property taxes. When the clerk stamped the documents and slid them into a tray, Eleanor squeezed my hand and said that this was what safety looked like for women who had learned too late to demand it. Afterward, she did something that surprised me. She asked me to promise not to use the house as leverage to win affection. She said that power used to beg for love only deepens the wound. If my parents reacted with anger or denial, she said that would not mean the decision was wrong. It would mean it was necessary. I promised her I would not explain her reasoning to anyone, not because it was shameful, but because it was not mine to defend. In the months that followed, Eleanor's health declined in fits and starts. My parents increased their presence in ways that felt strategic. They began talking openly about consolidating assets, about simplifying things for the family. My father mentioned more than once that it would make sense for the house to stay in the family line, by which he meant through Ethan. My mother nodded and talked about tradition. They never asked Eleanor what she wanted. They assumed continuity because it had always favored them. I kept my silence not out of fear, but out of respect for Eleanor's plan. She had taught me that there is a difference between secrecy and restraint. Secrecy hides wrongdoing. Restraint allows truth to stand on its own. When Eleanor passed, the shock in our family was loud and performative. There were phone calls and casseroles and stories told over and over, each one positioning my parents at the center of her life. Ethan spoke at the small memorial service about legacy and responsibility. My mother cried into her hands and talked about how Eleanor would have wanted us to stick together. I listened and took notes the way Eleanor had taught me to, not on paper, but in my mind, cataloging who said what and when. In the days after the funeral, my parents began sorting through Eleanor's belongings with a sense of entitlement that made my stomach knot. They talked about repainting the house, about renting it out, about selling it to fund Ethan's next restart. When I asked what their timeline was, my father snapped that it was not my concern. My mother pulled me aside and said they were under a lot of stress, that Ethan needed stability that Eleanor would understand. I did not argue. I did not reveal anything. I went home and checked the county records the way Margaret had shown me how to do. The deed was there exactly as it should be. My name printed cleanly in the database, unbothered by emotion. That permanence was both comforting and terrifying. I knew then that the confrontation Eleanor had predicted was inevitable, and that timing would matter. I also knew that my parents' plan depended on momentum, on moving quickly before anyone asked hard questions. When Ethan's debts became impossible to ignore, and my parents started talking about listing the house, I consulted Margaret again. She advised patience and preparation. She drafted the cease and desist letter in advance and told me to wait until they made their move. Justice, she said, works best when it responds to action, not threats. By the time Christmas approached and my mother called to invite me with a sweetness that felt rehearsed, I understood what was coming. They did not want me there because they missed me. They wanted me there because they believed the house was theirs to trade, and because they believed I would fall back into my old role when asked. I packed the folder with the property records, the recorded deed, and Margaret's letter, and I booked a hotel instead of staying in my childhood room. Eleanor had been clear. Protection only works if you use it. And when I walked into that dining room on Christmas night carrying the weight of months of preparation in my bag, I was no longer the girl who waited for permission. I was the owner responding to a challenge exactly as the law intended. The day Eleanor died, my parents moved faster than grief usually allows, and that speed told me everything I needed to know about their priorities. My mother, Linda Jones, 58, called relatives before she called me, organizing casseroles and condolences as if she were coordinating an event. My father, Robert Jones, 62, took charge of logistics with a tone that suggested authority rather than loss. Ethan Jones, 35, arrived late, eyes red but restless, already asking questions about what came next. They spoke in the language of tradition and continuity, words that sound comforting until you notice who they benefit. They talked about keeping things simple, about handling matters as a family, about avoiding lawyers because lawyers complicate things. That last part made my stomach tighten. When I asked whether Eleanor had left any instructions, my father waved his hand and said we would sort it out later, that now was not the time to dig through paperwork. My mother nodded and added that Eleanor had always trusted them to do the right thing. It was said as a fact, not a question. In the days that followed, they controlled the narrative with practiced ease. They told neighbors they were managing Eleanor's affairs. They told Ethan that the house would help him get back on his feet. They told me to rest, to take care of myself, to let them handle the stress. It was the same choreography I had grown up with, the same gentle push toward the sidelines. When I mentioned the attorney Eleanor had worked with, my father's face hardened. He said Eleanor had been stubborn, that she had been influenced, that it was best to keep things in the family. My mother took my arm and said, "Lawyers turn love into transactions that Eleanor would not want that." The irony was sharp enough to taste. While they spoke about honoring Eleanor's wishes, they did not once ask what those wishes were. They began clearing out the house within a week, sorting belongings into piles, keeping what felt valuable, discarding the rest. When I objected, my father snapped that I was being sentimental. Ethan joked about how the place could be renovated, how a fresh coat of paint would raise the value. I watched them make plans on a foundation they did not own, and I understood that this was not ignorance. It was assumption. They assumed that whatever Eleanor had done would ultimately bend back toward them because it always had. They assumed I would not challenge them because I never had. When the first realtor's card appeared on the kitchen counter, my mother brushed it away when she saw me looking. She said it was just exploratory, that nothing was decided, that I should not worry. Worry in her vocabulary meant object. That was when I stopped trying to be subtle. I called Margaret Hill and told her what was happening. She listened without interruption, then said calmly that we would document everything. She advised me not to confront my parents yet, not to warn them not to reveal the deed until they took a concrete step. People who rely on momentum, she said, panic when it stops. A few days later, my father announced at dinner that they were considering listing the house after the holidays, framing it as a practical necessity. He said Ethan needed liquidity, that the market was favorable, that Eleanor would have wanted the family to move forward. My mother looked at me expectantly, waiting for my agreement. The room held its breath the way it always did when my compliance was required. I felt the old reflex surge, the urge to smooth things over to be useful. Then I remembered Eleanor's hand squeezing mine at the clerk's office, her voice telling me that timing is part of justice. I said nothing. I let them talk. I let them build their certainty. Inside, I prepared. Margaret drafted the cease and desist letter and sent it to me in a sealed envelope. I printed fresh copies of the county records and placed them in the folder. I booked a hotel for Christmas week, a small act that felt like a declaration. When my mother called to invite me for Christmas dinner, her voice unusually warm, I accepted without enthusiasm or resistance. I knew the table they were setting. They believed the house was theirs to trade, and they believed I would play my assigned role. They had no idea that the ground beneath their plans had already shifted, recorded in ink months earlier, waiting for the moment when assumption would collide with fact. By the time Christmas arrived, I had rehearsed the evening in my mind the way people rehearse emergency exits, not because I wanted a confrontation, but because I refused to be surprised by one. I drove to my parents' house in a rental car instead of my old one, another quiet boundary, and I parked on the street rather than in the driveway where my father liked to stand and comment on arrivals. The neighborhood looked smaller than it had when I was a child, the sidewalks cracked, the same tired decorations blinking in windows like they had been blinking for decades. I paused before ringing the bell, feeling the familiar tightening in my chest, and then I breathed through it. When my mother opened the door, her smile was bright and brittle. She hugged me with the careful enthusiasm she used for guests and immediately commented on how busy she had been. My father appeared behind her, nodding, once his eyes already assessing. Ethan was in the living room, beer in hand, laughing too loudly at something on television. The house smelled like roast turkey and sugar and dish soap, a scent that carried more memory than comfort. I stepped inside and took in the details the way Eleanor had taught me to, noting the framed photos on the wall. Ethan in uniform, Ethan at graduation. Ethan shaking hands with people who looked important. There was not a single picture of me past the age of 10. My mother ushered me toward the kitchen and handed me a dish towel as if nothing had changed. She said it would be nice if I could help because she had so much on her plate. The phrase landed heavily because it always had. I tied the towel around my waist and chopped vegetables while my parents talked over me about Ethan's plans, about how next year would be different, about how the house might need some updates before it went on the market. They spoke as if the decision had already been made, as if momentum itself were permission. I listened without interrupting, filing away each assumption. When my father mentioned that a realtor would stop by after the holidays, my mother glanced at me quickly, a reflex she did not bother to hide. I said nothing. At the table, the seating fell into place automatically. Ethan took the end seat. My mother sat beside him. My father sat across close enough to loom. I took the side chair near the kitchen doorway, the same place I had occupied my entire childhood. The familiarity of it almost made me laugh. Dinner unfolded with the predictability of a ritual. Ethan talked. My parents affirmed. The good wine went to him first. When my mother finally turned to me, it was with the tone she used when checking off a box. She asked if work was still fine, if I was managing. She did not ask if I was happy. Ethan smirked and said I was always fine, that I had a knack for landing on my feet. Then he asked, casually cruel, if I was still doing my little office job or if I had finally given up on that phase. The word phase carried the same weight as worthless had earlier, a dismissal disguised as humor. My father chuckled. My mother did not correct him. I felt the room tilt toward expectation, the old script waiting for me to play my part. I set my fork down slowly, the motion deliberate enough to draw their eyes. I said that before anyone talked about selling anything or asking for help, we needed to clarify something. My mother's smile faltered. My father frowned and asked what I was talking about. Ethan laughed and told me not to start something on Christmas. I reached for my bag and felt the reassuring weight of the folder inside. I placed it on the table between the serving dishes and the candles, an intrusion of reality into a carefully staged scene. My mother stiffened, my father's shoulders squared. Ethan leaned back, confidence intact, certain this was another moment that would bend his way. I opened the folder and slid the top page forward without commentary. The county seal caught the light. My mother leaned in, eyes scanning. My father read over her shoulder, his breathing changing as he reached the name line. Ethan stopped smiling when he saw the address. I let the silence stretch not out of cruelty, but out of respect for the truth doing its work. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was thin. She said she did not understand what she was looking at. I said evenly that she was looking at the recorded deed and that according to the county, the house belonged to me. The words did not feel triumphant. They felt complete. For a heartbeat, no one reacted at all, as if the sentence had knocked the air out of the room, and it would take a moment for their bodies to remember how to breathe. Then, everything moved at once. My mother, Linda Jones, 58, shook her head hard, the way she always did when reality threatened her narrative. She said there must be a mistake, that she had lived in this house for decades, that papers could say anything if you knew how to twist them. My father, Robert Jones, 62, leaned forward and demanded to know where I got the document, his voice low and sharp, already reaching for authority. Ethan Jones, 35, laughed, but the sound was brittle. He said I was being dramatic again, that anyone could print something official looking, that I had always liked attention. I did not argue. I slid the next page out of the folder and placed it beside the first. Then another. Each page was a small, undeniable weight, recording numbers, dates, signatures. The notary stamp pressed into the paper like a bruise that never faded. I said quietly that the deed had been recorded 8 months earlier, that it was a living transfer executed by Eleanor Jones while she was alive, and that it was legally irreversible. My mother's face drained of color so quickly it was almost frightening. She whispered Eleanor's name like an accusation. My father grabbed the papers, scanning them with a desperation he did not try to hide. He said Eleanor had been confused, that she had been sick, that I must have pressured her. Hearing that made my chest tighten, but it also clarified something. They were not asking if it was true. They were deciding which version of the lie might still save them. Ethan stood up so abruptly his chair scraped the floor. He said this was his inheritance, that everyone knew it, that Eleanor would never cut him out like this. He said I had always been jealous, that this was revenge. I met his eyes and felt something settle into place. I said that inheritances are not assigned by expectation, and that Eleanor had not cut anyone out. She had made a decision about ownership while she was alive. My mother reached for my arm, her touch, urgent pleading. She said we were family, that this was not how families handled things, that I was humiliating them. My father slammed his palm on the table and told me to stop, his voice rising, the old threat returning. He said I was ungrateful, that everything I had came from them, that I did not get to walk in and take the house like a stranger. I did not flinch. I reached into my bag again and pulled out the sealed envelope. The letterhead was visible even before I opened it. Margaret Hill, attorney at law. My mother froze. My father went still. Ethan frowned, suddenly uncertain. I placed the envelope on the table and said this was a cease and desist letter effective immediately. It instructed them to stop any attempt to sell, refinance, or otherwise encumber the property. It warned that any violation would result in legal action. My mother began to cry, loud and sudden, saying she did not understand how things had gotten so out of control. My father said this was a betrayal, that I was tearing the family apart. Ethan leaned over the table, his face flushed, and shouted that I had stolen his future, that I had always been waiting to do this. The words hit me and slid off. I said calmly that I had not stolen anything. I said the house was never his to begin with, and that his future was not something Eleanor or I were responsible for funding. The room erupted, then voices, overlapping, accusations spiraling. Through it all, I stayed seated, my hands flat on the table, my voice steady when I spoke. I said that I had not come to punish them. I had come because they had asked me for help, and the only help I was offering was the truth. The truth was that the house was mine. The truth was that their plan to use it to rescue Ethan would not happen. And the truth was that this conversation had been coming for years. When the shouting finally slowed, something else filled the space. It was not anger, it was fear. And for the first time in my life, that fear did not belong to me. Fear has a sound when it settles into a room, and in my parents' house, it sounded like pacing, like the scrape of a chair leg, like my mother's breath catching between sobs as she tried to recalibrate. My father stood and began to walk back and forth along the length of the table, his hands flexing his jaw tight. He said we needed to calm down, that this was getting out of hand, that lawyers always make things worse. He said we should talk like adults and figure out a solution. Solution was his word for control. My mother wiped her eyes and said she did not understand why Eleanor would do this, why she would hurt the family this way. She said Eleanor had always believed in unity and tradition in taking care of your own. Ethan slumped back into his chair, anger curdling into panic. He asked what he was supposed to do, now his voice rising as if volume could fill the gap left by certainty. He said his debts were time-sensitive, that creditors were calling, that he just needed a bridge. He looked at me and said I had the power to fix this that I always had. The old script tried to reassert itself right there, the expectation that I would absorb the consequences and call it love. I felt my heart rate spike not from fear, but from recognition. I had seen this moment my entire life, the pivot where my needs were erased in favor of emergency. I said carefully that I was not responsible for his debts, and that I would not put myself back in danger to stabilize a system that had never protected me. My father stopped pacing and stared at me like I had spoken a foreign language. He asked what danger I was talking about, scoffing, as if the years of intimidation and control were a misunderstanding. My mother said I was exaggerating, that families fight, that nothing we went through was unusual. She said plenty of daughters had it worse, that I should be grateful. Gratitude in her mouth sounded like a muzzle. Ethan stood again and began listing sacrifices they had made for me, counting things I never asked for, turning basic parenting into leverage. He said he deserved the house because he was the oldest, because he was a man, because he was supposed to carry the family forward. The entitlement was naked now. I looked at him and said that tradition without accountability is just permission to repeat harm. My father's face darkened. He took a step toward me, his presence filling the space the way it had when I was younger. He said I was pushing him, that I needed to watch my tone. My mother rushed between us, hands raised, crying that this was not who we were, that Christmas was supposed to be about forgiveness. I felt my body respond before my mind could stop it, muscles tightening, breath shallow. Then I felt something else, the memory of Eleanor's voice, steady and sure. I reached into my bag again, not for another document, but for my phone. I placed it on the table face up and said that if this conversation escalated, I would leave, and if anyone tried to stop me, I would call for help. The words landed heavily. My father froze, the calculation visible on his face. My mother stared at the phone as if it were a weapon. Ethan laughed nervously and said I was being dramatic, but his eyes kept flicking to the door. I stood up slowly, keeping my movements measured. I said that this was not a negotiation. The house belonged to me. The legal protections were in place. Any attempt to pressure me, threaten me, or bypass the law would have consequences. I said I was willing to talk about next steps with lawyers present, not at a holiday table. My mother collapsed into her chair, sobbing about how everything was falling apart. My father muttered that this was not over. Ethan demanded to know where he was supposed to live. I said evenly that those were questions they needed to answer without me. As I picked up my bag, the room felt smaller, the air thicker, but I felt lighter than I ever had. I wished them a calm night and told them I would be in touch through counsel. When I walked toward the door, my father called my name, his voice sharp. I turned once and said that I had spent my life keeping the peace and that tonight I was keeping myself safe. Then I left, stepping out into the cold night air, my hands shaking not from fear, but from the release of it. The quiet, after I closed the door behind me, felt unreal, like the sudden silence after a fire alarm stops ringing, and I stood on the front steps for a moment longer than necessary, letting my body catch up to what had just happened. My legs were unsteady, my hands still trembling, but beneath that was something new, a steadiness I had never felt leaving that house before. In the past, every exit had been laced with apology or doubt, with the fear that I had gone too far or said too much. This time there was only clarity. I walked to my car and sat inside without starting the engine, breathing, slowly counting until my heart stopped racing. My phone buzzed almost immediately. A text from my mother asking me to come back inside so we could talk calmly. Then another from Ethan, angrier, accusing me of destroying the family, telling me I would regret this. I did not respond. I drove back to my hotel, checked in under my own name, and locked the door behind me with a click that sounded final. That night, I did not sleep much, but not because I was afraid. My mind replayed moments from my childhood, like old footage scenes that suddenly made sense now that I was no longer inside them. My father's voice in doorways, my mother's silences, Ethan's entitlement treated as inevitability. Seeing it clearly was exhausting, but it was also freeing. In the morning, I called Margaret Hill and told her exactly what had happened. She listened carefully, asked precise questions, and then said she was glad I had left when I did. She told me that the pattern I described was common when control is challenged, that escalation is often the last tool people reach for when entitlement fails. She instructed me to save every message, every voicemail, every attempt at contact. She said we would respond once formally and then we would let the law speak. True to form, my parents did not wait long. By midday, messages began piling up, some pleading, some threatening. My mother wrote long paragraphs about family loyalty, about how Eleanor would be heartbroken to see us fighting. My father sent a short message demanding a meeting, insisting we resolve this privately. Ethan sent a rambling text about stress, about how desperate he was, about how he never meant to hurt me, followed by another accusing me of cruelty. The emotional whiplash was familiar, but this time it did not pull me back in. Margaret drafted a single response addressed to all three of them. It stated the facts clearly. I was the legal owner of the property. All communication regarding the house would go through her office. Any harassment would be documented. Any attempt to access, list, or alter the property without my consent would be met with immediate legal action. I approved it and she sent it before the end of the day. The silence that followed was different from the silence of my childhood. It was not loaded with expectation. It was not waiting for me to fix something. It was empty, and that emptiness felt like space. Over the next few weeks, the fallout unfolded exactly as Eleanor had predicted. My parents attempted to consult their own attorney, who confirmed what they already knew but did not want to accept. The deed was valid. The transfer was clean. There was no leverage, no loophole, no appeal to tradition that could undo it. Ethan's situation deteriorated quickly without the imagined rescue. Creditors grew impatient. My parents scrambled, arguing among themselves now that there was no one else to absorb the pressure. I watched it all from a distance, informed but uninvolved. For the first time, their crisis did not become my emergency. On a gray January morning, I drove by Eleanor's house alone. I did not go inside. I just sat across the street and looked at it, the small bungalow with the familiar porch and the windows that had once glowed warm in the evenings. I thought about what it meant to own something without owing yourself away to keep it. I thought about how many years I had believed safety was something you earned through endurance. Eleanor had rewritten that belief with ink and foresight. As I drove away, I realized that the real inheritance she had left me was not the house, but the permission to live without asking, to protect myself without apology, and to walk away from chaos, even when it calls itself family. In the weeks that followed, the legal boundaries I had drawn began to change the shape of my days in small but unmistakable ways, like furniture rearranged after living too long in the same room. Without the constant vigilance of anticipating my parents' demands, I slept more deeply. Without the pressure to monitor Ethan's emergencies, my phone felt lighter in my hand. I kept my routine simple and steady, going to work, cooking dinners that were just for me, walking in the evenings when the air was cold enough to sharpen my thoughts. Margaret kept me informed without feeding the drama. She forwarded the essentials and filtered the rest. My parents attempted a few end runs, asking neighbors for advice, reaching out to distant relatives, trying to build a narrative in which I was confused or manipulated. Each attempt collapsed under the same weight of fact. The county records did not care about hurt feelings. The law did not respond to guilt. When my father finally sent a message that bordered on a threat, Margaret responded with a brief notice reminding him of the consequences. The messages stopped. I learned something important during that quiet. Boundaries do not just stop harm, they reveal it. With no access to me, my parents turned on each other. Old resentments surfaced, accusations sharpened, alliances shifted. Ethan blamed them for failing to secure his future. My mother blamed my father for being too harsh. My father blamed Eleanor for meddling. No one blamed the system they had built. I watched from a distance and felt grief without responsibility. Grief for what never was. Grief for the family I had hoped might exist if I just endured a little longer. And then, slowly, grief gave way to acceptance. I met with a contractor to assess the house, not to renovate it for profit, but to understand its needs. The inspection report was honest and manageable. I decided to keep it modest to preserve the parts Eleanor loved, the creaking step, the sunlit corner where she read. I changed the locks and updated the security not out of paranoia, but out of care. Ownership. I was learning is an active verb. It requires attention and intention. When I finally stepped inside the house for the first time alone, I did not feel triumph. I felt calm. I walked through each room, slowly opening windows, letting the stale air move. In the kitchen, I found the drawer where Eleanor kept her lists. In her handwriting, neat and unwavering, were notes about appointments, reminders to water plants, small observations about people. On the last page, there was a sentence written larger than the rest. Accuracy is kindness to yourself. I sat at her table and let the meaning settle. For years, I had been told that kindness meant yielding, that love meant absorbing harm, that peace meant silence. Eleanor had shown me another model. Kindness could be precise. Love could be protective. Peace could be enforced. I hosted a small gathering a month later, nothing grand, just a few friends who had stood by me through the years. We cooked together and laughed, and when someone asked about my family, I answered plainly without performing resilience or inviting sympathy. The story did not own me anymore. It was just information. One evening, as I was locking up, I noticed a letter taped to the mailbox. It was from my mother, written carefully, the tone subdued. She said she was sorry for the pain, that she wished things had been different, that she hoped we could talk someday. There was no mention of the house, no request, no demand. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. I did not respond immediately. I was no longer in a hurry to resolve feelings that had taken decades to form. Time, I had learned, is not a debt you owe. It is a resource you protect. When I thought of Christmas now, I did not think of the table or the shouting. I thought of the moment I placed the papers down and chose myself. Justice had not arrived as fireworks or applause. It had arrived as an ordinary morning with less fear in it, as a lock that clicked closed, as a life that finally felt like my own. Spring arrived quietly, the way change often does when it is real, and with it came the slow work of rebuilding a life that no longer revolved around managing other people's storms. I spent weekends at the house not fixing it in a rush, but learning it, understanding its rhythms the way Eleanor once had. I learned which windows caught the morning light, which floorboard creaked no matter how gently you stepped, which corner of the yard held water after rain. Each discovery felt grounding, like reclaiming pieces of time that had been stolen in smaller, less visible ways. Friends helped when I asked, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to be there. That difference mattered more than I expected. Without realizing it, I had internalized the belief that needing help was dangerous, that it came with strings. Here, it did not. When something broke, we fixed it. When something was too heavy, we carried it together. No one kept score. My parents remained mostly silent during those months, the legal boundary holding firm like a fence they had finally stopped testing. Occasionally, information reached me through relatives. My father had become withdrawn, angry at the world, in ways that no longer had an easy target. My mother tried to hold things together, managing appearances, explaining absences, insisting everything was fine. Ethan drifted, cycling through short-term jobs and long explanations, his confidence eroding without an audience to reinforce it. I felt sadness when I heard these things, but not guilt. Sadness acknowledges loss. Guilt demands repair. I was done repairing what I did not break. One afternoon, while sorting through Eleanor's old paperwork, I found a small envelope tucked inside a cookbook. Inside was a note in her handwriting dated just weeks before she died. She wrote that she hoped the house would give me room to breathe, that she had worried for years about how much weight I carried quietly. She said that if anyone ever tried to make me feel cruel for protecting myself, I should remember that cruelty thrives where accountability is absent. I sat at the table and let the words settle. For so long, I had measured my worth by how much I could endure without complaint. Now endurance was no longer the metric. Choice was. Safety was. One evening, as the days grew longer, my phone rang with a number I recognized but had not seen in months. It was my mother. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was careful, almost rehearsed. She said she had been thinking a lot, that she realized mistakes had been made, that she wanted to talk just the two of us, no lawyers, no drama. She said she missed me. I listened once, and then again, paying attention not just to what she said, but to what she did not. There was no acknowledgement of the years of pressure, no mention of my father's intimidation, no recognition of how unsafe I had felt. There was regret, but it was vague, untethered from responsibility. I did not call her back right away. I talked it through with my therapist instead, naming the fear that rose in me at the idea of stepping back into that dynamic. We talked about boundaries as ongoing practices, not one-time events. We talked about how reconciliation without accountability often becomes another form of self-abandonment. When I finally responded, it was by text. I said I was open to communication, but only with a mediator present, and only if the conversation focused on concrete behaviors, not general feelings. I did not know if she would accept those terms. That uncertainty felt strangely peaceful. For the first time, the outcome was not my responsibility to manage. Weeks passed before she replied, agreeing hesitantly, asking what that would look like. I sent her Margaret's contact information. I did not hear back. And that, too, was information. Summer came, and with it a sense of continuity I had never known. I planted a small garden in Eleanor's yard and watched it grow because I paid attention, because I showed up consistently. It struck me how simple that formula was and how little it resembled the chaos I had been taught to call family. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sun went down, I realized something essential. The justice in my story was not that my parents lost control, or that Ethan lost his safety net. It was that I gained a life where my nervous system could finally rest, where love did not feel like a test, where the future was not a threat to survive, but a space to step into deliberately. I locked the door behind me that night and felt no urge to look back. By late summer, the story had settled into something quieter and more honest, and I began to understand that endings are rarely loud when they are real. The mediator my mother had tentatively agreed to never received a follow-up call, and after a few weeks of silence, I stopped waiting for one. The absence of response was not rejection. It was confirmation. My father did not reach out at all. When distant relatives asked careful questions testing whether I was open to reconciliation, I answered with facts rather than feelings. I said the house was mine. I said communication was through counsel. I said I wished everyone well. The simplicity of it surprised people who were used to drama, but simplicity had become my language. Work stabilized in ways it never had before, because I was not splitting my attention between survival and ambition. With the house as a fixed point, I made plans that extended beyond the next emergency. I enrolled in a certification I had postponed for years. I accepted a promotion that required travel, trusting that my life would not collapse if I stepped away for a week. Each decision reinforced the last. Stability breeds courage, not the other way around. In August, a letter arrived from my parents' attorney requesting a meeting to discuss family matters. Margaret read it and advised a brief, structured response. We declined. There was nothing left to discuss that had not already been decided by law. I expected anger to follow perhaps another attempt to pressure me. Instead, nothing came. The silence this time felt final. I learned later through a cousin that my parents had downsized abruptly, selling their own home under less favorable conditions than they had hoped. The market had shifted. Timing once again mattered. Ethan moved in with a friend and talked about starting over in a new city. I felt a flicker of hope for him, not because I believed he would change, but because distance sometimes forces honesty. Still, hope did not require my involvement. On a cool evening in September, I hosted a small dinner at the house, the first time I felt ready to invite people into that space without bracing for conflict. We sat on mismatched chairs, ate simple food, and talked about ordinary things. At one point, a friend asked what it felt like to win. The question startled me because it assumed a contest. I thought about it for a moment and said that it did not feel like winning. It felt like alignment, like my actions finally matched my values. Later, alone in the kitchen, I noticed a new habit forming. I moved through rooms without scanning for danger. I made decisions without rehearsing defenses. My body was learning a new normal. I realized then how much of my past had been shaped by invisible violence, the kind that does not leave bruises but trains you to shrink. Naming that mattered. It reframed my endurance not as weakness, but as evidence of what I had survived. One afternoon, while organizing Eleanor's papers for archiving, I found a receipt for the clerk's office fee, the small amount she had paid to record the deed. Tucked behind it was a note written in the margin of an envelope. She had written that justice does not have to be dramatic to be effective, and that quiet protection lasts longer than loud confrontation. I smiled and placed the note in a frame on my desk. As fall approached, I made a final decision about the house. I would live in it part-time and rent the rest to a tenant who needed stability more than spectacle. The lease was clear, fair, and kind. It reflected the values Eleanor had taught me. When the tenant moved in, grateful and careful, I felt something close to peace. Not because the past had been erased, but because it no longer dictated my choices. On a Sunday morning walking through the neighborhood, I passed my parents' old street and did not turn down it. I kept walking, aware of the ease in my steps. The story that began with favoritism and fear ended with something far less cinematic, but far more durable. A life built without permission. A boundary enforced without cruelty. A home defined not by who claimed it, but by who tended it. And in that ordinariness, I found the clearest proof that justice had done its job. The final lesson did not arrive as a confrontation or a confession, but as an ordinary choice on an ordinary day, which is how real change tends to announce itself. One October morning, I woke early and sat at the small desk near the window, reviewing a lease renewal and a work proposal side by side. The ease of doing both without a knot in my stomach felt unfamiliar enough that I paused to notice it. For most of my life, decisions had carried hidden costs, emotional fallout I would later be asked to absorb. Now the costs were visible, measurable, and mine to accept or decline. I signed what aligned and set aside what did not. That clarity extended to family in ways I had not anticipated. When my mother sent a short message wishing me a happy birthday, I replied with a thank you and nothing more. There was no guilt attached to the brevity. When my father did not reach out at all, I noted it without interpretation. Silence was no longer a verdict. It was simply information. At work, colleagues commented on a steadiness they had not seen before. The way I handled pressure without apologizing for needing time or resources. I realized that the habits formed in survival had followed me everywhere and that releasing them required intention. I practiced asking for what I needed plainly. I practiced saying no without explanation. Each practice reinforced the truth Eleanor had left me with. Protection is not aggression. It is clarity backed by process. One afternoon, I visited the clerk's office again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to close a loop. I requested certified copies of the deed and placed them in a fireproof box at the house. The clerk smiled politely, unaware of the significance of the act, and handed me the documents with practiced efficiency. Walking back to my car, I felt a strange gratitude for systems that function without favoritism for records that do not care who raised their voice first. That neutrality had saved me. In November, a distant relative invited me to a holiday gathering, carefully noting that my parents would not be there. I accepted and found the evening unexpectedly gentle. There were no performances, no tests of loyalty. When the topic of family arose, it did so briefly and passed without urgency. I realized how much energy I had spent trying to manage other people's discomfort and how light the world felt when I stopped. On a cold evening near the end of the month, I returned to the house after a long day and found the porch light glowing the tenant already home music faint through the window. The house was being lived in, not argued over. That felt like a small victory for the version of me who once believed safety was temporary. I made tea and sat at the table where Eleanor had taught me to read documents, to ask questions, to trust the ink when voices grew loud. I thought about the way favoritism had warped my family, how elevating one child had diminished everyone else, including the child it claimed to protect. The law had not healed that wound. It had simply stopped it from bleeding into my life. Healing was something I was doing slowly, deliberately, with support that did not demand repayment. As winter approached, I made plans that did not include my parents, house my childhood chair, or my role as buffer. I booked travel for work and for pleasure, confident that my absence would not cause collapse. On the first snowfall, I walked the neighborhood and watched the flakes settle on roofs and sidewalks, equal and indifferent. I smiled at the thought that justice often looks like that. Not punishment, not triumph, but a quiet redistribution of weight. When people ask me now what happened to my family, I tell them the truth without ornament. We changed. I protected myself. The house stayed standing. The rest sorted itself out. And when they ask what I learned, I tell them this. If someone tells you that keeping the peace requires your silence, they are asking you to fund their comfort with your safety. You can say no. You can write it down. You can put it on record. And sometimes that is how a life finally becomes your own. The year closed without ceremony, and that in itself felt like a gift. I spent December differently than I ever had before, not bracing for impact, not measuring my words, not scanning rooms for shifts in mood. I stayed in my own space, kept plans small, and let the days pass without assigning them meaning beyond what they already carried. On Christmas morning, I woke early and made coffee, the house quiet except for the hum of the heater and the distant sound of traffic. There was no table to perform, at no hierarchy to navigate, no silence to manage. I took a walk after breakfast, the air sharp and clean, and felt a calm that would have once seemed impossible. Later that day, a message arrived from my mother, brief and careful, wishing me peace. I replied with a simple thank you. There was no urge to explain or reconcile or resolve. Peace did not require agreement. It required distance and honesty. In the afternoon, I met a friend for a meal and we talked about ordinary things about work and weather and plans that extended past the next crisis. Ordinary had become extraordinary. As the week went on, I reflected on how much my understanding of justice had changed. For years, I believed justice meant someone admitting fault, someone apologizing loudly enough to balance the scales. I waited for recognition, for validation, for an acknowledgement that would make the past make sense. What I learned instead was that justice is often procedural. It is records filed correctly. It is boundaries enforced consistently. It is choosing not to re-enter spaces that harm you simply because they are familiar. The law did not make my family kinder. It made them irrelevant to my safety. That distinction mattered. On New Year's Eve, I sat at the desk and wrote goals for the coming year, not grand resolutions but practical commitments. To maintain my boundaries without justification, to invest in relationships that are reciprocal, to keep my finances transparent and my records organized, to notice the early signs of pressure and respond with clarity rather than endurance. Each line felt achievable because it was grounded in reality, not hope. At midnight, I stepped outside and watched distant fireworks bloom over the city, small and scattered, and felt no desire to be anywhere else. In January, work demanded more travel, and I moved through airports without the old anxiety of being unreachable. When my phone buzzed, it was with messages that did not carry obligation. When it did not buzz, the silence was not a summons. I spent a weekend at the house tending to small repairs, replacing a broken latch, resealing a window. The acts were modest, but they carried weight. Care without fear changes how you move. One afternoon, while sorting mail, I found a forwarded letter from a relative who had heard a version of the story and wanted to know my side. I replied with facts and nothing else. There was no counter-narrative to build, no reputation to manage. Truth did not require defense. As winter gave way to early signs of spring, I noticed how my body responded differently to stress. The tightness in my shoulders eased faster. Sleep came more easily. Decisions took less rehearsal. Healing was not dramatic, it was cumulative. It showed up in the absence of dread, in the confidence to choose, in the willingness to walk away without explaining. When I think now about the night the property records hit the table, I do not replay the shouting or the shock. I remember the weight of the paper, the steadiness of my voice, the way fear changed hands. That moment did not make me powerful, it made me free. And freedom, I have learned, is not the ability to control outcomes. It is the ability to live with them without losing yourself. The story ends not with reconciliation or revenge, but with continuity, a house cared for, a life aligned, a future no longer negotiated under pressure. That is enough. If there was a final reckoning, it came not from my family, but from myself in the quiet audit of what I had survived and what I no longer needed to carry forward. Early one morning in February, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and wrote down the beliefs that had shaped my life without my consent. That love required sacrifice without limits. That peace was earned by silence. That being the reliable one meant being replaceable. Seeing those sentences on paper stripped them of their authority. They were not truths. They were adaptations, strategies I had learned in an environment that rewarded compliance and punished resistance. I crossed them out deliberately and replaced them with new ones. Love is mutual and measurable. Peace requires boundaries. Reliability does not mean erasure. The exercise felt simple, almost mundane, but it marked a turning point more significant than any argument I had ever won. Around that time, I received a call from a community legal clinic asking if I would consider speaking to a small group about property rights and living deeds. Margaret had mentioned my case as an example of proactive planning. I hesitated at first, not because I was ashamed, but because I was wary of turning my life into a lesson. In the end, I agreed on one condition. I would speak about process, not family drama. The room was small, filled mostly with older women taking notes, nodding as I explained how records work, how ownership can be clarified before crisis, how preparation protects the vulnerable. When questions came, they were practical and urgent. How do you check the county database? How do you choose an attorney? How do you keep copies safe? I answered, carefully aware that information can be a form of power. Afterward, one woman thanked me quietly and said she wished she had known these things sooner. I told her it was not too late. I meant it. As spring edged closer, my work life expanded in ways that felt aligned rather than draining. I was invited into rooms where my voice mattered not because I absorbed pressure, but because I brought clarity. I noticed how often women apologized before speaking, and I made a point to stop doing it myself. The habit broke slowly, but it broke. On a rainy afternoon, I visited Eleanor's grave alone. I did not bring flowers. I brought updates. I told her the house was stable, that the garden was growing, that I was safe. Standing there, I realized I no longer needed her protection in the way I once had. She had given me the tools to protect myself. That is what good caretaking does. It teaches you how to stand when the hand lets go. Driving away, I passed the courthouse where so many disputes begin and end, and I felt gratitude not for conflict, but for resolution. The law had been a boundary, not a weapon. It had drawn a line where my family could not. As the months unfolded, contact with my parents dwindled to nothing. There were no dramatic last messages, no final apologies, no redemption arc. There was simply distance sustained and respected by default. That distance allowed something else to grow. Curiosity about who I was without the weight of expectation. Confidence in decisions made without permission. A sense of ownership that extended beyond property into time, energy, and choice. When people hear my story now, some expect bitterness. They expect anger. What they often find instead is something quieter. Precision. I am precise about what I allow and what I do not. I am precise about where my responsibility ends. That precision is not cold. It is kind. It prevents harm before it needs to be confronted. The house still stands unremarkable from the street, just another place with a porch and a light in the window. But inside, it lives a life that was once deferred and is now underway. And that, more than any confrontation or consequence, is the clearest ending I could have hoped for. The last shift was subtle, almost easy to miss, but it was the one that told me the story was truly finished. It happened on a random Tuesday when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number, and for the first time in my life, my body did not brace itself before I answered. The caller was a title officer confirming a routine update related to the house, a minor administrative matter that required nothing more than a signature and a returned form. We spoke for less than 5 minutes. When the call ended, I sat there for a moment, struck by how ordinary it all was. There was no spike of anxiety, no fear that something unseen was about to unravel. Ownership, I realized, had finally become normal. That normalcy extended outward into other parts of my life. I stopped over-explaining my choices at work. I stopped anticipating disappointment before it appeared. When people asked about my family, I answered briefly and redirected without apology. The need to be understood by everyone had dissolved. Understanding myself was enough. In April, I hosted a small workshop at the house for women interested in financial independence. Nothing formal, just conversation around the table Eleanor once used for sorting mail. We talked about budgets, about documents, about the difference between generosity and obligation. Several women shared stories that mirrored mine in different ways of being expected to carry weight quietly because they could. Listening to them, I recognized how common invisible labor is, how often it is mislabeled as love. When the evening ended and the house grew quiet again, I felt Eleanor's presence not as memory but as continuity. The work she had started was still unfolding not through conflict but through competence. Around that time, I received one final message from my father. It was short and formal, informing me that they would no longer contest anything related to the house, and asking that future contact go through attorneys if necessary. There was no warmth in it, but there was acknowledgement. I read it once and archived it. Closure does not always come with tenderness. Sometimes it arrives as compliance. I did not respond. There was nothing left to say. Summer returned, and with it a rhythm that felt earned rather than imposed. I spent mornings working with focus and evenings tending the garden, noticing how growth follows attention without force. I laughed more easily. I rested without guilt. I planned trips months in advance, confident that nothing would implode in my absence. One evening, as I locked the door and turned off the lights, I caught my reflection in the window and paused. The woman looking back at me stood differently. Shoulders relaxed, gaze steady. She did not look like someone waiting to be corrected. She looked like someone at home. When people ask now what happened after the property records hit the table, I tell them the truth. Nothing dramatic. The shouting ended. The threats stopped. Life went on quieter and better. Justice did not announce itself. It simply removed what no longer had the right to stay. And in that space, I built something durable. A home, a self, a future that no longer requires permission. What surprised me most in the end was not how much my life changed, but how quickly the change became ordinary once I stopped resisting it. The absence of constant conflict created room for habits I had never practiced before. Habits that looked small from the outside but felt radical from within. I began making decisions based on preference rather than consequence, choosing where to live, how to spend weekends, and who to prioritize without running the outcomes through an invisible committee in my head. The mental space this freed up was startling. I read more. I exercised consistently. I took classes that interested me without asking whether they were practical enough to justify their existence. Each choice reinforced the next, like laying stones across a river I had once believed was uncrossable. I noticed, too, how my relationship with money shifted. For years, money had been a tool for crisis management, something to allocate toward other people's emergencies or future disasters. Now it became a planning instrument. I budgeted calmly. I saved deliberately. I invested with intention rather than fear. The house, once a symbol of conflict, became a reference point for stability. It did not demand gratitude or obedience. It required maintenance, attention, and respect. Those were terms I could agree to. On a warm afternoon, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and thought about how often women are taught to confuse endurance with virtue. I had worn endurance like armor, believing it kept me safe, when in reality it kept me exposed. Letting it go did not make me weaker. It made me accurate. Accuracy, I had learned, is a form of self-respect. There were moments of sadness, of course. Grief does not disappear because boundaries are enforced. It just loses its authority to dictate behavior. On birthdays and holidays, I felt the echo of what might have been, but the echo did not pull me backward. It passed like weather. I allowed myself to miss the idea of family without returning to the harm of it. That distinction felt like maturity rather than loss. One evening, while organizing the last of Eleanor's papers for long-term storage, I found a receipt from a hardware store dated years earlier. On the back, she had written a short note to herself about replacing a lock and checking the porch light. The ordinariness of it made me smile. She had been planning for safety in practical ways long before I understood why it mattered. Her legacy was not dramatic foresight. It was consistency. As the year turned again, I realized that my story no longer needed an audience to feel complete. It did not require validation, comparison, or a final moral delivered at volume. The truth was simple. Favoritism had shaped my family. Law had interrupted it. Choice had replaced obligation. The rest followed naturally. When people ask me now what advice I would give to someone in a similar position, I keep it grounded. Document what matters. Trust process over promises. Do not confuse guilt with responsibility. And remember that leaving does not make you disloyal. Sometimes it makes you alive. On the night I finished organizing the last box, I turned off the light, locked the door, and stood for a moment in the quiet hallway. The house felt settled. So did I. There was no applause, no reconciliation, no sudden transformation of others. There was simply a life proceeding without interference. That was the ending Eleanor had prepared me for, and the one I chose to keep. The second winter in the house arrived without ceremony, and that was how I knew the story had truly closed. There were no lingering threats, no surprise messages, no sudden attempts to renegotiate what had already been settled. The quiet was no longer fragile. It was structural. It held. I spent evenings reading in the living room, the same room where Eleanor once sat with her lists and her careful questions, and I felt a continuity that did not depend on approval. The house no longer felt like something I had to defend. It felt like something I inhabited. When I thought about my parents now, it was without urgency. They existed at a distance defined by their choices rather than my reactions. Occasionally, news filtered through relatives. My father had retired earlier than planned, frustrated and withdrawn. My mother focused on appearances, volunteering, hosting small gatherings that felt curated rather than intimate. Ethan drifted between jobs and cities, telling new versions of old stories. None of it required my response. Distance had done what arguments never could. It had revealed patterns without inviting me to participate in them. I noticed how often people equate forgiveness with access, as if absolution must include proximity. For me, forgiveness became something quieter. It meant releasing the hope that my parents would ever become different people. It meant no longer rehearsing conversations that would never happen. It meant allowing myself to move forward without dragging the past behind me like proof. That release did not excuse harm. It simply refused to center it. At work, I was asked to mentor a younger colleague who reminded me of myself years earlier, competent, careful, used to carrying more than her share. In our conversations, I emphasized skills rather than sacrifice process, rather than endurance. I watched her shoulders relax over time, watched her confidence grow as she realized she did not have to disappear to succeed. Seeing that change felt like a quiet correction rippling outward. One afternoon, while updating insurance documents for the house, I caught myself smiling at the absurdity of how much peace came from paperwork done right. The same systems that once felt intimidating now felt empowering. They were not cold. They were fair. They did not care who raised their voice or who claimed tradition. They responded to facts. In that reliability, I found trust. As the year drew to a close again, I hosted a small gathering, smaller even than the last. Just a few people whose presence felt uncomplicated. We cooked together, laughed, and lingered without agenda. At one point, someone asked what the house meant to me now. I thought about it and said that it was not a symbol anymore. It was just a place where my life fit. That answer surprised me, but it felt right. Symbols are heavy. Homes are practical. On the final night of the year, I stood on the porch and watched snow fall lightly, the street quiet and even. I did not feel the need to mark the moment with reflection or resolve. The work had already been done. The boundaries were in place. The life was underway. When I went back inside and locked the door, the sound echoed softly through the hallway, familiar and reassuring. This was not an ending built on confrontation or victory. It was an ending built on sustainability. A future no longer shaped by who was favored or who was loudest, but by what was true and what endured. And that, at last, felt complete. The story ends the way most honest lives do not, with a final confrontation, but with a steady continuation that no longer needs to prove itself. 1 year after the night the property records hit the table, I stood in the kitchen and replaced a worn hinge on a cabinet door. It was a small repair, ordinary and unremarkable, and that was the point. I had become someone who fixed what needed fixing and left the rest alone. The cabinet closed smoothly. The house did not ask for drama, it asked for care. That exchange felt fair. As I cleaned up, I thought about how many years I had spent preparing for emergencies that were never mine to manage. Now, preparation meant something else. It meant planning vacations because I wanted them. It meant saving for goals that belonged to me. It meant keeping records, current locks, working boundaries intact. None of it felt heavy. It felt adult. When I passed people in the neighborhood, they waved without curiosity about my past. I waved back without offering explanation. At work, I was trusted with responsibility because I handled it well, not because I absorbed chaos. In friendships, I showed up without performing usefulness. The absence of constant negotiation revealed who stayed for me, not for what I could carry. There were moments when memory surfaced unexpectedly, the echo of old patterns, the reflex to minimize or appease. When it did, I noticed it and let it pass. Habits fade when they are no longer rewarded. On a clear afternoon, I visited the courthouse again, not for a filing, but to attend a public lecture on consumer rights. I sat in the back and listened as an attorney explained how systems work when people know how to use them. The room was full of ordinary faces, people seeking clarity rather than confrontation. I felt a quiet solidarity there. Knowledge is not loud. It spreads by repetition and example. Afterward, I walked home and cooked dinner thinking about how justice had entered my life as a process, not a verdict. It did not shame anyone into change. It simply limited harm and allowed growth elsewhere. That distinction mattered more than any apology I never received. As the evening settled, I opened a drawer and took out Eleanor's note, the one I had framed earlier, and placed it back among the papers she had trusted me to keep. I did not need it displayed anymore. The lesson had integrated. Accuracy is kindness to yourself. It guided my choices now without announcement. When people asked me whether I ever thought about going back, about trying again, I answered honestly. I think about what is possible and I choose what is safe. Those are not the same thing. Safety does not preclude love. It defines its terms. In my life now, love shows up as consistency, as respect, as the absence of fear. It does not ask me to disappear. On the last night of the season, I turned off the lights and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the house settle. There were no raised voices in the walls, no tension carried forward by habit. Just the quiet sounds of a place doing what it was built to do. Shelter. I locked the door and placed the keys on the hook by the entrance, a small ritual that marked belonging without obligation. If there is a moral to this story, it is not that law defeats family or that strength requires severance. It is that clarity changes outcomes. When expectations are named, when records are kept, when boundaries are enforced without cruelty, life recalibrates. The golden child narrative loses its power when accountability enters the room. The invisible child becomes visible to herself first. That is where change begins. I went to bed that night without rehearsing conversations or anticipating demands. Tomorrow would arrive and I would meet it as I am, not as a role assigned to me. The house would stand, the records would hold, and the life I built would continue ordinary and intact. That is the ending I keep.